This video is about the cemetery in Berkhamsted, which covered an important period of history in Berkhamsted from the earlier parts of the Industrial Revolution through to the eventual dismemberment by voluntary exercise of giving independence to each of its colonies and the new relationships that Britain has with the European countries and other parts of the world. The commentary is in three bits. This bit talks about the history of Berkhamsted from evidence from the Berkhamsted Local History and Museum Society and the book written by Scott Hastie on the history of Berkhamsted, running from evidence of activities here in the hunter-gatherer period through to the Roman period, when there was a villa in the North Church area with a temple in it, the building of Aikman Street, the road from St Albans to Cirencester, which became important later on, runs through Berkhamsted, to the Saxon period, AD 700, where there's some evidence of settlement here, and then the Norman invasion, which brings us back to the Aikman Street, which is virtually the Roman equivalent of the M25 of those days. And apparently the Normans defeated Harold at Hastings in 1066, then advanced and tried to cross the Thames and got rebuffed, and did a flanking movement round the Aikman Street until they arrived in Berkhamsted, where eventually they accepted the defeat of the English. The Plantagenets then built a castle in Berkhamsted, which a number of the members of the Plantagenet family lived in for a period of well over 400 years, up to 1495, including some well-known British people, or English people, shall we say, during that period. The Black Prince, for example, who lived in that castle for some time, times, Thomas à Becket, Robert, and other people as well, and poets and people like that. Of course, Berkhamsted had a service to the castle with people living in the town round about it, and it was relatively prosperous, as prosperous would be in those days, in the Middle Ages and early parts of the 10th and 9th and 11th, 12th, 13th centuries and so forth. Berkhamsted then went into decline, and it's all about connectivity, as the people will tell you. And the next bit of connectivity that got Berkhamsted aroused was the building of the canal. The canals in the late 18th century and so forth, followed fairly shortly after that in the early part of the just beginning of the Victorian period, when the railway reached here, and then Berkhamsted, having been connected, became a much more prosperous town, and continues for that much to this day. The Chilterns being a very popular place to live if you want to work in London or something like that, with trains that leave Euston from 1:30 in the morning onwards and sort of thing. So it's the latest trains at 1:30 in the morning, I should say. So it's quite a good place to live from that point of view. And of course, we've been through the whole of the Victorian period, the rise of the British Empire and its eventual dismemberment by voluntary action, one has to say, and then the search for Britain's new place in the world, which is still being looked at the end of December 2020. The second bit of the commentary is actually some of the interesting people in the cemetery, which is a very formative part of the history of Berkhamsted and the history of Britain, for that matter. And then the last bit is the hopes for the future and what the future might bring. That's after the central commentary. Thanks for listening to this. In Berkhamsted at Braintree Lane. And this is the cemetery was first opened in 1820. And when you think of the nearly 200 years since then, the history of the world has changed enormously. At that time, the British Empire was reaching its height. It's now gone. All the colonial countries in Western Europe have lost all their colonies. It used to take weeks, if not months, to get to Australia. It's now eventually became Burroughs Wellcome and the Wellcome Trust Pharmaceutical Company. They're buried there in the cemetery. And pharmaceuticals these days are totally, completely different from what was probably a leech medical economy in those days. Anyway, the thing is, the work involved rescuing the walls, which were due for collapsing, as you see just here. Trees have been planted near the walls and they've grown into them and were pushing them over. And so there's a fairly big reconstruction of the walls required. A wildlife area, which you just saw there, has been established. This is a repair of one of the walls where they put a little archway underneath. And that just then was the list of people who died in the various World War II. The World War I general at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. And then other people, there's a widow of a major general in, I think, World War II, buried in the thing. And of course, an awful lot of people who, the movers and shakers of Berkhamsted, not just the Coopers, but others as well. One of the more interesting graves is that of the lady who was committed to, her name is Hewson, committed to money from her will. And she had a grave paid for by one of the persons she'd been a benefactor of, who really was really thankful to her for what she'd done for him. As you can see, the various graves were being rebuilt. There was stonemasonry work done, as well as lots of volunteers who cleared rubbish and so forth. People who adopted graves and who looked after them. And in fact, it was a combined effort of a great many people over a period of 9 weeks or so. These clips were taken almost every day during the period from the 15th of June until the Heritage Days at the early part of September. That's Mrs. Hewson's grave there. And as each grave was being lit, there's an RFC seat donated to the Royal Flying Corps people. And of course here we are rebuilding one of the walls, which was knocked down quite badly in all the work that was done. I imagine that we're going to be doing this for a number of years. It's all been handled under the organisation of Moya, and it's a pretty massive sort of operation. I think it's interesting that there's a very strong influence of religion, as you'd expect in a cemetery, but it seemed to be from the memorials much stronger then than it would be today. Of course, a lot less people, I think this is Smith Dorian's grave here, a lot less people go to church these days. Only about 15% of the people are Church of England people. But nevertheless, I think this should be regarded as the celebration of these people's lives. Here's the wall being rebuilt at the southern end. It took some time to do that. And the clearing up right at the top of the hill, it up looks very nice. It's an extremely pleasant place with long-term views over the progress. And here's some buttresses on the wall and all the sand that was brought in. One of the big jobs was the gate post, which we saw just then, that had to be underpinned. A very tricky sort of job that was, and then reconcreted back, and eventually almost totally rebuilt with the caps put on the top as one of the last things for the Royal Flying Corps. and this I think is the Cooper's memorial. And here's some of the volunteers doing some clearing up one day when I met them. Funnily enough, most of the work seemed to be done during the mornings. Although I came out in the afternoon normally, I hardly saw anybody working there. You saw some of the graves then that had been looked after by somebody and being put into good shape by planting flowers and tilling the soil. And in fact, the chap, I think his name's Mike from the British Legion, is particularly looking after the British Legion's memorial thing with the list of all the war grave people is at the beginning of the cemetery, at the northern entrance to it. Some of these graves look fairly expensive, not perhaps particularly these ones are fairly standard graves, but the ones with the crosses and the great memorials. But it's interesting to note that obviously some of these people must have been dead a long time before even their successors passed on, and consequently some of the gravestones broke in some restoration. The cars finishing off. Here's one of the stonemasons doing a bit of work. There's some of the equipment that was used for digging things up and so forth like that. This is the Countess of Bridgewater's memorial. She donated more than half the cemetery land when it was extended later on. One of the Edgertons, who was a good egg, looked her predecessors who tried to enclose the common, resulting in an uprising by the people of Berkhamsted, and they stopped it. Funnily enough, when I used to live in Manchester, we used to play lots of land in the north of England, and in fact they made their money from coal in Salford, which they then brought to Manchester on one of the first canals ever to be built, the Bridgewater Canal, which is still a major canal for tourism, part of the Cheshire Ring. And here we are at the end of the work. It's all been done. 3 Close Lane, the wall there has been restored and looked after, and some place to stay. Now, perhaps a look towards the future, because the UK has come to a crisis point, one might like to call it, in its relationships with the world. It's a developing situation, and I think we've been struggling to find out what our relationship with the rest of the world will be, as has been true for a number of the European colonial countries as they tried to rule the world through their colonies in the 17th, 18th, 19th and perhaps the early part of the 20th century. And of course they immediately clashed with each other over trying to make money, resulted in 2 really disastrous world wars. First World War was pretty disastrous. Second World War, in the European zone, 50 million people were killed in one way or another, including the Holocaust, when millions of Jews were killed by the Nazis. And in the eastern, the Chinese lost 20 million people in their fight with the Japanese and so forth, and somewhat oppressive pressure the British put on them during the Opium Wars. But all that's over now, of course. China has become a world power and may become the biggest world power in the future. We don't know. China's trying to find its way as well. An interesting experiment for political historians, that's going to be. It's also a very interesting experiment for political historians for Western Europe, the United States of America, and other countries in the world, especially developing countries such as Brazil, Indonesia, how India is going to develop now, one of the second largest country in the world. And there is no clear way as to what is going to happen in the future. To a degree, it seems that business or trade will determine quite a lot of what goes on. And people want to make money. There's a picture of the new car park in Berkhamsted just there, by the way. And trade does help, one of the troubles is that businessmen often think that it's a winner takes it all situation, and of course it really should be winners for all sizes if it's ever going to work. Respect for human rights and so forth like that. The good things that came out of the wars were things like the United Nations and cooperation and so forth. And there's been a very good recent example of cooperation on the Armistice Day parades, celebrating all the people who lost their lives in World War II and World War I. It's interesting that the scientists all over the world, China, Russia, the West, America, all have been cooperating with each other to try and overcome this pandemic which has just struck us all of coronavirus, or SARS COVID-19. There's even work going on between Russia and AstraZeneca and Oxford University in seeing if their two coronaviruses, the Oxford one and the Sputnik 5 one, will do a better job perhaps than, or as good a job as some of the others. And of course inoculations of the first one to get officially approved are now taking place. And there is cooperation going on after all. NASA and the Russians have cooperated for some years in getting people into orbit and on the International Space Station. The trouble is, each other's trying to undermine each other by the new connectivity, which is the connectivity of the internet. Now that actual roads and railways are not so important apart from transporting goods, obviously very important for that, but not for transporting people. What's the point in going from Manchester to London in 1 hour? I used to be able to do it in 8 hours when I first lived in Manchester. When you can do it in 10 seconds or less than that on the internet and have a much clearer picture on Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever way you care to do it. And I think that's going to be the future, isn't it? All my children anyway are working from home, apart from one who has to work in the school. She has to go there for that, and even some of the schoolwork is being done over the internet these days. So that is going to be an important part of the future, and I think that people, because of nuclear weapons now, very few countries are ever going to go to war with each other, even though they might hate each other's guts. And I think that one will hope that people will tend to relax and not try and rule over everybody else as they have done in the past. It does mean that the idea of having a totally powerful leader has got to go by the board. That really means, in the truth of it, that royal families will have to be abolished as being rulers, although there's no harm in people calling themselves royal in my view if they want to do that as part of their ancestry, because it is a bit of history and we have to recognise that. However, having one person in charge, as happens in Russia and in China now, I think is unsatisfactory, and we need to make sure that there isn't an autocracy in all countries. And whether countries should really believe that everything outside their borders has nothing to do with the people elsewhere. It is to do with the people elsewhere, because we've all got to cooperate with each other. And one can only hope that common sense will prevail, otherwise we're absolutely doomed. And personally, I've always been terribly optimistic. I've always survived all sorts of exercises during my life. I've had some very serious illnesses and survived them. I've reached the age of 90 now, and I'm still going strong, I like to think. And my wife is still going strong, even though she's got a bit of dementia, but we sing songs to each other, we recite poems to each other, and we enjoy life even after all of that. And that takes a bit of doing, I think. So that's why I'm looking forward to the next few centuries, when the world really settles itself and does really good for all of, not just mankind, but everything who lives in it as well. We need to preserve not only all the wildlife, but all the things that grow, and for that matter, in other parts of the universe as well. And maybe we'll meet up with our so-called aliens, and they won't be so threatening as we thought they were, and we mustn't be threatening them either. Thanks for listening to this. I hope you found it of interest, and it may be of some interest to historians of some sort. That's the end. Bye now. And thanks very much to James Moyer, I think it's Dr. James Moyer, and Kate Campbell, and particularly to the local history and museum society of Berkhamsted. Goodbye.